This is the Wells Meridian Holdings charity launch. What do you bring to this? A jacket cover drywall dust?
I asked you to come with me tonight. My father died 3 weeks ago.
A guy who fixes other people's broken old buildings?
Good evening, Mr. Wells. We have been awaiting your arrival. Miss Monroe is already in the main library.
Jordan? What is he talking about? Who are you? You're not gonna yell at me, I was?
Yelling wouldn't change anything, Alexis, and you already know how foolish you were.
And I think I owe you the truth, even if it makes me look terrible.
A guy who fixes other people's broken old buildings doesn't belong in a place like this. Get out of the car. Alexis didn't look at me when she said it. Her eyes were fixed on the towering iron gates of Ashworth Hall, glowing under the heavy autumn twilight just outside Millhaven, Georgia. She adjusted the strap of her crimson bodycon dress, her fingers tight with tension. In the back seat, her mother, Carol, didn't hesitate. She grabbed my worn canvas duffel bag, the one holding my change of clothes and a notebook full of structural schematics, and tossed it right out the window onto the damp gravel driveway. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. "You're embarrassing us, Jordan," Carol muttered, not even bothering to turn around. "Alexis has a real future to build tonight. You've dragged her down long enough." Next to Alexis, in the driver's seat of the sleek black Mercedes SUV, sat Bradley Kent. He was 8 years younger than me, wearing a flashy patterned suit that screamed money he hadn't earned yet. Bradley caught my eye in the rearview mirror and offered a smooth, practiced smirk. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. He adjusted his grip on the leather steering wheel, shifting the car into park as if he already owned the place. 2 years ago, he was just a former college classmate who had, coincidentally, bumped into Alexis at a downtown Atlanta lounge. Now he was sitting where I used to sit, driving the car I had helped pay for, taking my wife to the biggest private gala of the year. "Alexis," I said softly, keeping my voice level, "are you serious about this?" "I'm exhausted, Jordan," she said, finally turning her head. Her face was impeccably made up, sharp and striking, but her eyes were cold. "This is the Wells Meridian Holdings charity. Launch. The entire board is inside. Heavyweights from New York, London, Tokyo. People who manage billions. I'm the director of public relations for my firm, and Bradley set up the introductions. What do you bring to this? A jacket covered in drywall dust?" "I asked you to come with me tonight because my father died 3 weeks ago," I said. She scoffed, letting out a short, bitter laugh. "Your father was a handyman who lived in a rented house in rural Alabama, Jordan. You've been grieving for 3 weeks like he left behind an empire. I supported you through your quiet moodiness, but tonight is business. I need to be in that room. You just stand in the corner looking like a lost contractor." She reached across, unlocked the passenger door, and pushed it open. "Get out," she repeated. "We're running late." I looked at her for 3 seconds. 11 years of marriage. 5 years of watching her slowly slide away into a world of surface-level status, fueled by her mother's constant whispers and Bradley's glossy promises. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stepped out of the SUV onto the gravel, cold rain beginning to drizzle down on my simple navy suit, jacket. The moment my shoes hit the ground, Bradley pulled the door shut and put the car back in drive. He rolled up to the heavy security booth at the entrance of Ashworth Hall. Through the rain, I watched Alexis lean out the driver's side window, handing her guest card to the chief security officer standing inside the glass booth. "Alexis Wells, Carver PR," she told the guard, smoothing her hair. "And Bradley Kent, representing Apex Capital. We're on the VIP list for the Gerald Wells Memorial Foundation press announcement." The guard took the card, swiped it through his terminal, and waited. A red light flashed on the console. A sharp, loud beep echoed across the driveway. The guard frowned, typing manually into his system. He looked at the screen, then looked back at Alexis. "Card invalid, ma'am. Access denied." Alexis's composure cracked for a fraction of a second. "That's impossible. Check it again." My firm handled the regional press releases for this event. Bradley's fund is in talks with members of the Wells Meridian board. I don't care who you're in talks with, ma'am, the guard replied neutrally. The system says your access pass was revoked 10 minutes ago. Revoked? By whom? Carol leaned forward from the back seat, her voice rising in panic. Do you know who we are? Call whoever is in charge inside. Alexis pointed furiously through the windshield, spotting me standing 30 feet back in the rain with my duffel bag over my shoulder. It must be a system glitch. That man behind us, my husband, he was supposed to be my guest, but I removed him. Just let the vehicle through. The guard didn't answer her. He was looking past the Mercedes, his eyes widening as he read something on his main monitor. Suddenly, every screen inside the security kiosk lit up in bright amber. The automatic bollards in the driveway began to hum, lowering into the asphalt. A massive digital display above the wrought iron gate, usually displaying the estate logo, flashed white. Bold black text rolled across the screen. Guest vehicle stopped. Clear lane for primary access. Holder, Jordan Wells, sole heir. The security guard froze. He immediately stood up at attention, reaching for his radio. Across the manicured courtyard of Ashworth Hall, 3 armed security detail officers dropped what they were doing and sprinted toward the main gate. Inside the SUV, Bradley's smirk vanished. Alexis turned around in her seat, staring at the gate screen, then slowly turning her head to look back at me standing in the driveway. The iron gates began to swing wide open with a deep mechanical groan, but they weren't opening for the black Mercedes SUV. Gordon Ashby, the veteran head butler of Ashworth Hall, stepped out from the side entrance of the security office, holding a large black umbrella. He completely ignored the Mercedes, walking past the driver's side window without giving Alexis, Bradley, or Carol a single glance. He walked directly up to me, stopping 2 feet away, and bowed his head respectfully as he held the umbrella over me. "Good evening, Mr. Wells," Gordon said, his voice crisp and steady, carrying clearly through the damp night air. "We have been awaiting your arrival. Miss Monroe is already in the main library with the estate board. Your father's seat has been prepared for you." I took a breath, looking past Gordon at the stunned faces inside the SUV. Alexis had unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped half out of the car, her red dress catching the rain, her eyes wide with total confusion and growing horror. "Jordan?" she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time in years. "What is he talking about? Who are you?" I didn't answer her. I grabbed my canvas bag from the wet gravel, handed it to Gordon, and started walking through the open gates into Ashworth Hall. The heavy oak doors of Ashworth Hall swung shut behind me, sealing out the damp night air and the stunned silence left on the driveway. Gordon led me down a grand, wood-paneled hallway, lined with portraits of men and women whose faces shared my jawline. He took my wet suit jacket and offered me a heated towel, his movements calm and practiced. "The estate board is gathered in the primary library, Mr. Wells," Gordon said quietly. "Miss Monroe has kept the meeting brief, as requested. She knew you would need a moment." "Thank you, Gordon," I said, wiping the rain from my face and hands. "Give me 5 minutes." He nodded, stepped back, and left me alone in the long corridor. I walked over to the tall, arched window overlooking the main gates. Outside, through the steady drizzle, I could still see the red taillights of Bradley's Mercedes SUV, parked uselessly on the shoulder just beyond the security perimeter. The guard wasn't letting them through. Standing there in the quiet of my family's ancestral home, my mind pulled back through 11 years of marriage to Alexis. When we first met, she didn't care about luxury cars or invitations to private galas. We were 24, living in a small 2-bedroom apartment near Midtown Atlanta. I was working long, physical hours as a junior structural specialist, spending my days on scaffolding inside dilapidated 19th century buildings, restoring cracked granite columns, reinforcing rotting wooden bell towers, and saving historical structures that city planners wanted to bulldoze. My crew called it noble work. We were preserving the physical history of the city. In those early days, Alexis loved what I did. She used to drop by my job sites with paper cups of cheap coffee, sitting on concrete blocks just to watch me map out structural schematics. I remembered one night, 5 years into our marriage. Her father had suffered a sudden heart attack at his house in rural Georgia. Alexis had called me at midnight, hysterical and trembling. I didn't ask questions. I jumped into my work truck, drove 3 hours through a blinding thunderstorm, and walked into the hospital waiting room before the doctors had even finished their initial evaluation. I sat next to her in that cold, sterile room until 4 in the morning, holding her hand while she cried. When her father pulled through, she pressed her forehead against my chest and whispered words I had carried with me ever since. "I knew I wanted to stay with you forever. Not because you're flashy, Jordan, but because you show up when everything else falls apart." I believed her, but people change, not in a single dramatic instant, but in slow, quiet increments that you don't notice until the distance between you becomes unbridgeable. It started when Alexis got promoted to Director of Public Relations at Carver PR. Her social circle shifted from neighborhood friends to corporate executives, hedge fund managers, and women whose lives revolved around country club memberships and seasonal European vacations. Then came her mother, Carol. Carol moved into a condo 20 minutes from our house, and her daily phone calls became a relentless drumbeat of quiet poison. Every conversation turned into a subtle audit of my worth. "Did you see David bought a second house in St. Simon's?" Carol would say over Sunday dinner, cutting her steak with deliberate slowness. "And Mark was just named managing partner at his firm. It must be nice for Sarah to finally stop worrying about money." Alexis began to listen. Slowly, my work wasn't noble to her anymore. It became a source of embarrassment. When colleagues at corporate mixers asked her what her husband did, she stopped saying I was an architectural preservationist. She would offer a forced, practiced smile, say, "Jordan works in property consulting," and immediately steer the conversation toward her latest client campaign. In the last year of our marriage, she openly referred to my career as a low-paying hobby. She never knew the truth about who I was, because I had spent my entire life hiding it, even from the woman I shared a bed with. My legal name on public records was Jordan Kessler. When I was 7 years old, 2 men had attempted to kidnap me from the parking lot behind my private elementary school in downtown Atlanta. They were caught before they could make it out of the state. But the incident terrified my father, Gerald Wells. Gerald was the founder and majority shareholder of Wells Meridian Holdings, a massive, privately held global empire spanning clean energy development, international shipping fleets, and deep-sea data infrastructure. The true net worth of the company was rarely discussed in public, but the internal balance sheets placed it at over $840 billion. To keep me safe from extortion, corporate espionage, and kidnapping threats, my father made a radical decision. He hired a team of high-profile legal fixers to scrub my existence from every public document, linking me to the Wells name. He gave me my mother's maiden name, Kessler, and ensured I grew up with a completely normal, unglamorous identity. I went to a public high school, paid my own way through engineering school on academic scholarships, and built my career from the ground up without a dime of family leverage. My father and I maintained a close, quiet relationship. I visited him several times a year at Ashworth Hall or at his private retreat in the North Georgia mountains. I never brought Alexis. It wasn't that I didn't want to tell her. In the beginning, I planned to share the truth once we were settled and secure. But every time I brought myself to the edge of telling her, something happened that made me pull back. 2 years into our marriage, at a dinner party hosted by one of her wealthy clients, a young contractor was sitting at our table. Alexis laughed loudly at a cruel joke someone made about men who settle for manual labor because they lack real ambition. Another time, when we drove past a historic church I was working on, she looked out the window and muttered, "What a waste of time and money. Some people just don't know how to build real wealth." Each small, casual comment proved to me that she loved the idea of success more than she loved the person standing beside her. So I kept my secret. Now, looking through the rain-streaked window at the gate where she had just thrown me out of her car, I realized that my silence hadn't just protected my father's legacy. It had exposed who Alexis really was when she thought no one was watching. I turned away from the window, walked down the corridor, and pushed open the heavy double doors to the library. Estelle Monroe was standing by the mahogany fireplace in the primary library, holding a slim leather folder. At 58, the longtime legal director of the Wells family looked as formidable as ever, her graying hair pulled into a sharp, low bun. She was the only person outside my father who had known the entire truth about my identity since the day I turned 18. "You look wet, Jordan," Estelle said, her voice dry and steady as she closed the folder. "And I take it your arrival was less than quiet." "Alexis left me at the gate," I said, leaning against the edge of the large readings table. "She had Bradley Kent in the driver's seat." Estelle didn't show a hint of surprise. "Then Mr. Kent is currently sitting in a blocked vehicle outside our perimeter, wondering why his forged press credentials and private meeting requests just turned into a federal liability." "Good. It saves us the trouble of escorting him off the property later." She walked over and laid 3 printed sheets of paper on the table in front of me. "We finished the internal audit on Apex Capital 48 hours ago," Estelle continued. "Everything you suspected 2 years ago during that library project in downtown Atlanta was accurate. Bradley Kent never met your wife by accident." My mind shifted back to 24 months prior. I had taken on a structural restoration contract for a century-old public library in central Atlanta. The city wanted to restore the granite facade, but the building's property records were a mess of historical land trusts and holding companies. While sifting through property deeds and structural variance permits in the basement archives, I noticed a parent entity named Meridian Urban Heritage, LLC, a subsidiary directly managed under the clean energy and infrastructure umbrella of Wells Meridian Holdings. Attached to one of the secondary filing documents was a formal corporate inquiry letter dated 14 months prior. It was signed by Bradley Kent on behalf of Apex Capital, a boutique hedge fund based out of Charlotte. The letter laid out detailed, highly specific questions about Wells Meridian's private clean energy grid developments across the Southeast, information that was never made public. I had snapped photos of the documents and sent them straight to Estelle. "When you brought me those papers," Estelle said, tapping the documents on the table, "I hired a private intelligence firm to pull Bradley Kent's complete communications log, financial disclosures, and travel records from the previous 3 years. What we found was a deliberate, methodical campaign." She flipped to the second page, showing a timeline lined with dates and locations. "Bradley Kent spent 6 months researching your father's quiet holdings," Estelle explained. "He knew Gerald Wells had a son named Jordan, who lived under the surname Kessler in Atlanta. He couldn't verify your exact voting share percentage because your father kept that buried under 3 layers of offshore trusts, but Kent knew enough to realize you were the key to the family's private structure." "So he didn't bump into Alexis at that lounge in Midtown," I said. "Not even close," Estelle replied coldly. "Our investigators verified that Kent paid an event planner $8,000 to find out which corporate mixers and high-end lounges Alexis frequented for her PR job. He spent 3 weeks showing up at the exact same spots until he accidentally sat next to her at the bar on a Tuesday night." I looked at the timeline. The first documented meeting between Alexis and Bradley took place 22 months ago. That was right around the time Alexis started coming home late from client dinners, complaining more frequently about my long hours on construction sites and my lack of ambition. "He targeted her vulnerability," Estelle said. "Alexis was hungry for social climbing, and Kent gave her an immediate platform. He introduced her to mid-level venture capitalists, paid for expensive dinners, and promised her firm access to Apex Capital's media budget. But her friendship wasn't his end goal. She was his wedge into the Wells Meridian ecosystem." "How deep did he get?" I asked, looking Estelle in the eye. "Deep enough to compromise 2 members of our board," Estelle said, her expression turning stern. Over the past 18 months, while Alexis was boasting to her mother about Bradley's high society connections, Kent was using her social events to arrange quiet, off-the-record meetings with Marcus Vance and Arthur Pendleton. Vance and Pendleton were two veteran directors on the Wells Meridian board. My father had trusted them with operational oversight for over a decade, but both were getting old, greedy, and increasingly nervous about the future leadership of the corporation. Kent fed them a narrative, Estelle explained. He told Vance and Pendleton that Gerald Wells was dying without a clear, public corporate successor. He convinced them that if the $840 billion empire fell into the hands of an unknown, unproven structural contractor who spent his life fixing old churches, the stock value of our private subsidiaries would collapse. He proposed a forced sell-off of our clean energy division to an offshore consortium, a consortium where Apex Capital stands, to pull a $400 million finder's fee. I stood silently for a long moment, watching the fire crackle in the hearth. Everything fell into place. The sudden coldness from Alexis, her mother Carol's constant badgering, Bradley's arrogant presence in my home. It was all built on a calculated lie designed to strip away my inheritance before I even stood up to claim it. Did Alexis know about the clean energy deal? I asked quietly. Estelle shook her head with a look of mild pity. Alexis didn't know a thing about the board maneuvers, Jordan. To Bradley Kent, your wife was never a partner or a confidant. She was just an insecure woman with a useful name and an appetite for status. He used her to get into the room, and the moment he got what he wanted from Vance and Pendleton, Alexis became completely disposable to him. Estelle pulled a digital audio recorder from her pocket and placed it on the table. This recording was captured by our internal security team 4 days ago in a private dining room at the Regency Hotel, she said, pressing play. A crisp, clear voice came through the speaker. It was Bradley Kent, speaking over the sound of clinking glasses. "Don't worry about the wife," Bradley's voice rasped through the speaker, full of arrogant confidence. "Alexis thinks we're buying a penthouse in Buckhead once this deal closes. She has no idea what's actually happening. Once the board votes to liquidate the energy division and I secure the transfer rights from Vance, I'm cutting her loose. She served her purpose." The recording stopped. "The press conference starts in 20 minutes in the main ballroom," Estelle said, closing her folder. "The full board is seated, including Vance and Pendleton. Media outlets from across the country are tuned into the live stream. What do you want to do, Jordan?" I straightened my tie and looked toward the heavy library doors. "Let's go give them the announcement they paid to see," I said. The grand ballroom of Ashworth Hall was packed. Over 200 people filled the space under massive crystal chandeliers. National news reporters, financial analysts, regional politicians, and the complete board of directors of Wells Meridian Holdings. Camera crews from major networks had their lenses trained on the raised mahogany stage at the front of the room, broadcasting the event live to millions of viewers worldwide. In the back row, seated near the double doors, Alexis sat perfectly still. She had managed to enter the room using her secondary press pass from Carver PR, leaving her mother Carol pacing anxiously in the foyer outside. Next to her, Bradley Kent sat with his arms crossed, his suit looking slightly crumpled after their tense argument at the security gate. His face was pale, but he was still trying to maintain an air of calm authority. "It's just a technical error with the gate system," Bradley had whispered to her 2 minutes earlier, though his eyes kept darting nervously toward the front stage. "Whatever name was on that security monitor was just a system glitch. Just let the press briefing start." Alexis didn't answer him. Her eyes were fixed on the stage. The heavy side door opened, and Estelle Monroe walked up to the podium, carrying a thin leather binder. Behind her walked 2 uniformed officers from the State Financial Crimes Division and 3 senior legal counsel members. And behind them came me. I had taken off my damp raincoat, wearing the simple navy suit jacket Alexis had mocked hours earlier. I didn't glance toward the back row. I walked straight to the center of the stage and stood beside Estelle, looking directly out at the room full of cameras and familiar faces. Gasps rippled through the front row of board members. Marcus Vance and Arthur Pendleton, sitting side by side in executive leather chairs, both stood up halfway before catching themselves. Vance's hand trembled so violently, he dropped his printed meeting agenda onto the floor. Estelle stepped up to the microphone. The room fell into total, heavy silence. "Good evening," Estelle's voice echoed clearly through the ballroom speakers. Tonight was meant to be a simple press announcement regarding the establishment of the Gerald Wells Memorial Foundation. However, before we discuss the charitable endowment, there are critical corporate governance disclosures that must be made on the public record. She pressed a remote control in her hand. The large digital projector screens mounted on either side of the stage lit up. The first document to appear was a certified court order signed by a federal judge, accompanied by an official birth certificate, and a trust registry deed bearing the seal of the state of Georgia. "As of 8 o'clock this morning," Estelle announced calmly, "all testamentary conditions set forth by our late founder, Gerald Wells, have been fully satisfied. Pursuant to the master trust agreement established 31 years ago, 38-year-old Jordan Wells, known publicly as Jordan Kessler, has assumed full legal title as the sole heir to the Gerald Wells estate." A massive murmur erupted across the room. Photographers surged forward, flashbulbs lighting up the stage like lightning. "Mr. Jordan Wells now holds 58% of the active voting shares in Wells Meridian Holdings," Estelle continued, her voice cutting through the noise. "He exercises absolute controlling authority over all parent companies, clean energy subsidiaries, maritime fleets, and digital infrastructure assets valued at $840 billion. In the back row, Alexis felt her throat go completely dry. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide as she read my full legal name next to my father's signature. The man she had called a low-paid contractor, the husband she had dumped on the side of a wet gravel road, was standing on stage holding total control over the largest private enterprise in the country. She slowly turned her head to look at Bradley. "Bradley? What is this?" Bradley didn't answer. Sweat was glistening on his forehead. Estelle pressed the remote again. The screens changed. "Furthermore," Estelle said, her tone dropping into something icy and ruthless, "the board has opened a formal internal investigation regarding an attempted fraudulent transfer of company assets. Over the past 14 months, an entity known as Apex Capital, managed by Mr. Bradley Kent, engaged in illegal corporate espionage, forged internal transfer agreements, and leaked unauthorized financial data to foreign speculative funds." The screen displayed clear side-by-side comparisons of forged internal documents, wire transfer records, and private email threads linking Bradley Kent directly to unauthorized negotiations involving Wells Meridian's clean energy grid. "Mr. Kent attempted to leverage two members of our board, Marcus Vance and Arthur Pendleton, to execute a forced liquidation of our clean energy division, in exchange for a $400 million offshore finder's fee," Estelle stated publicly, looking directly at the cameras. Shouts broke out from the media gallery. Vance and Pendleton both stood up, their faces pale, trying to shout over the noise, but security guards immediately stepped up behind their chairs, blocking their path. "That is false! This is an unverified attack!" Bradley yelled out from the back of the room, standing up from his chair, his hands shaking as he pointed toward the stage. "Apex Capital has legitimate advisory agreements. You can't broadcast unproven allegations." Estelle didn't even flinch. She picked up a small silver remote, aimed it at the main audio system, and pressed play. Bradley's voice boomed through every speaker in the ballroom, crystal clear, unedited, and unmistakably arrogant. "Don't worry about the wife. Alexis thinks we're buying a penthouse in Buckhead once this deal closes. She has no idea what's actually happening. Once the board votes to liquidate the energy division, and I secure the transfer rights from Vance, I'm cutting her loose. She served her purpose." The recording cut off. The silence that followed was deafening. Every camera in the ballroom swung toward the back row. Reporters turned in their seats, pointing lenses directly at Bradley Kent and Alexis. Alexis didn't move. She couldn't breathe. The sound of Bradley's recorded voice echoed in her ears like a physical blow. The penthouse, the high society introductions, the promises of a brilliant new life. It was all a scam. She wasn't his partner. She was just a useful idiot he had used to open a door. Bradley took 2 steps backward toward the exit, but 2 plainclothes financial crimes agents who had been standing by the doors stepped into his path, blocking the exit. One of them produced a pair of steel handcuffs. I stepped up to the microphone, looking past the flashing cameras, past the panicked board members, straight into the back row where Alexis sat alone amidst the chaos. "The meeting is adjourned," I said quietly into the microphone. The moment I stepped down from the stage, the ballroom erupted into total chaos. Reporters pushed past security ropes, flashing cameras and shouting questions at the top of their lungs. But the real spectacle wasn't happening near the podium. It was unfolding 50 feet back, near the heavy double oak doors of the main foyer. Bradley Kent was trapped. 2 special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, accompanied by 3 officers from the Georgia State Financial Crimes Division, stood directly in front of him, blocking the exit. One of the lead agents, a tall man in a dark charcoal suit named Agent Miller, pulled a heavy manila folder from his leather briefcase and unclipped a pair of polished steel handcuffs from his belt. "Bradley Kent," Agent Miller said, his voice flat and authoritative, carrying over the surrounding noise. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, and illegal interception of proprietary data under Title 18 of the United States Code." Bradley's face drained of every drop of color. His arrogant posture collapsed in an instant. His hands were shaking so violently that he dropped his designer leather phone case onto the marble floor. "You're making a massive mistake," Bradley stammered, stepping back until his spine hit the wooden doorframe. "I'm a managing director at Apex Capital. We have formal advisory, inquiries filed with state regulators. This is a private corporate dispute, not a federal matter." "Your advisory inquiries were built on stolen internal credentials, Mr. Kent," Agent Miller replied calmly. "And the $400 million offshore holding account you opened in the Cayman Islands under a shell name was flagged by the Department of the Treasury 3 hours ago. Place your hands behind your back." In the middle of the crowd, Carol rushed forward, her face twisted in panic. She grabbed Bradley by the sleeve of his patterned suit jacket, her voice high and shrill. "Bradley, do something. Call your partners in Charlotte. Tell these people who you are. You promised Alexis that Apex Capital was closing a $30 million PR retainer with your firm next week." Bradley turned on Carol with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. He violently snatched his arm out of her grip, shoving her back a step. "Shut up, Carol," Bradley snapped, his voice crackling with desperation. "Just shut your mouth. You don't know anything about how this business works. Get your hands off me." Carol froze, staring at him with her mouth open. She had spent 2 years treating Bradley like royalty, holding him up as the gold standard of what a successful man should be, endlessly contrasting his flashiness with my simple construction clothes. Now, surrounded by federal agents and dozens of flashing news cameras, he was screaming at her like a cornered animal. Agent Miller stepped in, grabbed Bradley's right wrist, and snapped the steel cuff around his joint. "Hey, don't touch me!" Bradley shrieked, struggling uselessly against the agent's grip. He turned his head frantically, spotting Alexis standing motionless 5 feet away, her face pale as snow, her eyes wide with total shock. "Alexis!" Bradley yelled, his voice strained and ugly. Tell them you brought me those internal meeting schedules. Tell them you were the one who gave me access to the regional PR calendar." Alexis backed away slowly, her hand pressed against her throat. I gave you press summaries, Bradley. You told me it was standard industry protocol for market research." "Don't play stupid with me now," Bradley spat, his face turning red as the second handcuff clicked into place behind his back. You wanted the Buckhead penthouse. You wanted the luxury invitations. You knew exactly what I was doing. You were so eager to get rid of your loser husband that you didn't ask a single question. You're just as guilty as I am. A wave of camera flashes blinded them both as press photographers captured every word of Bradley's breakdown. The recording that had played on the main speakers moments ago was still playing in everyone's minds, his own recorded voice explicitly stating that Alexis was just a tool to be discarded once the deal closed. Hearing him scream at her now, blaming her for his own crimes, completely stripped away whatever illusion Alexis had maintained about their relationship. Behind Bradley, Marcus Vance and Arthur Pendleton were also being escorted toward the side exits by estate security officers and state investigators. Vance was bent over, holding his head in his hands, trying to shield his face from the news cameras. Pendleton was quietly weeping into a handkerchief, his 30-year corporate career destroyed in less than 20 minutes on live television. "Get him moving," Agent Miller ordered his team. 2 officers flanked Bradley, lifting him slightly by his arms as they pushed him through the heavy double doors into the rain, where 3 black federal sedans were idling with their emergency lights flashing red and blue against the wet asphalt. From the top of the grand marble staircase leading out of the ballroom, I stood next to Estelle Monroe, watching the federal agents load Bradley into the back seat of the lead vehicle. "Wall Street has already reacted," Estelle said quietly, holding up her tablet screen. Apex Capital's primary institutional investors pulled $300 million in capital allocations, 45 seconds after the livestream feed cut off. By tomorrow morning, the firm won't exist. Kent's partners in Charlotte are already filing affidavits, claiming they had no knowledge of his individual actions. "He thought he was the smartest guy in the room," I said softly, watching the police lights flash through the rain. "He was an amateur who bought into his own hype," Estelle replied, closing her tablet. "Men like Bradley Kent always assume that quiet people are weak people, Jordan. He thought because you spent your time working on old stone buildings instead of doing media, interviews, you didn't have the stomach to protect what belongs to you." I took a deep breath, turning away from the window. "Where is Alexis?" "She's still down in the foyer," Estelle said, giving me a measured look. "Her mother is having a full hysterical breakdown on the sofa, and Alexis is standing by the doors, waiting for you. Do you want security to clear her out?" "No," I said, buttoning my navy suit jacket. "I'll talk to her." The rain had tapered off into a fine, cold mist as I pushed open the glass doors at the rear of Ashworth Hall and walked out into the estate's rear. Gardens, high stone walls enclosed the space, surrounding manicured boxwood hedges, gravel pathways, and a dark granite fountain that hummed softly in the damp night air. I stepped off the terrace and stood near the edge of the central walkway, breathing in the smell of wet earth and ancient brick. Behind me, the heavy glass doors opened and closed with a soft click. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of high heels against the wet flagstones echoed down the stone corridor. Alexis stepped onto the terrace. She had taken off her silver drop earrings, holding them tightly in her palm. The crimson dress she had worn with such confidence 3 hours ago was slightly damp at the hem, catching the cool night air. Her hair was losing its polished curl, clinging slightly to her cheeks, but her face wasn't distorted with anger or frantic tears. The raw, overwhelming shock of the last hour had flattened into a quiet, exhausted reality. She walked down the 3 stone steps into the garden, stopping 10 feet away from me near the edge of the fountain. For almost a minute, neither of us said a word. The distant sounds of police sirens leaving the front gates faded into the Millhaven night, leaving only the steady trickle of water against the fountain stone. "You're not going to yell at me?" Alexis asked. Her voice was surprisingly steady, but completely drained of its usual sharp edge. "You're not going to tell me how foolish I was?" "No," I said, turning slightly to face her. "Yelling wouldn't change anything, Alexis, and you already know how foolish you were." She looked down at her shoes, tapping the toe of her designer heel against a crack in the stone. A faint, bitter smile touched her lips before disappearing. "I didn't come out here to beg you to take me back," she said quietly, "or to tell you that I made a mistake because I was confused. That would be a lie, and you've always hated lies." "I appreciate that," I said. Alexis looked up, her dark eyes meeting mine in the dim garden light. "I want to tell you something, Jordan, and I think I owe you the truth, even if it makes me look terrible." "Go ahead." "I knew," she said simply. I didn't interrupt her. I just waited. "I didn't know Bradley was trying to commit federal fraud or steal your father's clean energy grid," Alexis continued, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. "I'm not smart enough about corporate finance to have understood that, even if he had told me. But about him? About who he was as a person? I knew something was wrong, not at the beginning, when he first started showing up at my client events. But halfway through..." She took a slow breath, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold mist. "I noticed how he talked to servers when he thought I wasn't looking," she said. "I saw how he lied to his own investors on the phone, telling them he was in meetings he had never scheduled. I saw how he used people, dropped them the moment they weren't useful, and changed his personality depending on who was standing in the room. I knew he was slippery. I knew he was superficial." She looked directly into my eyes, not flinching. "And I kept going anyway," she said. "I stayed in his car. I let him take me to dinner. I invited him into our life and into my bed. Do you want to know why?" "Why?" I asked, keeping my tone level. "Because I decided that even if Bradley was a liar, even if he was fake, the lifestyle he represented was still better than what I thought I had with you," she confessed, her voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "I looked at you, Jordan, coming home every night smelling of plaster dust and old timber, covered in dirt from fixing some broken church tower or 100-year-old library basement. I looked at our simple house in Atlanta. I listened to my mother tell me every Sunday that my friends were moving into gated communities, while I was married to a man who had no drive to climb the ladder." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I convinced myself that you were weak. I convinced myself that you were comfortable settling for mediocrity, because you didn't have the guts to want more. So when Bradley offered me a seat at the table with people who managed millions, I took it. I didn't care if his money was real, or if his promises were hollow. I just wanted out." I listened to every word without cutting her off. In a strange way, hearing her speak with such brutal honesty was cleaner than any fake apology she could have offered. My mind drifted back 5 years. I remembered the sterile waiting room at North Georgia Memorial Hospital. I remembered driving 3 hours through a wall of rain after her father's heart attack, sitting on a hard plastic chair until 4 in the morning, holding her cold, trembling hand while she wept. I remembered the way she had looked at me that night, pressing her forehead into my shoulder, telling me that she loved me because I was the only person in her world who showed up when everything else fell apart. For years, I had held on to that memory like an anchor. Every time Alexis mocked my career, every time she rolled her eyes when I talked about structural engineering, every time her mother dropped a cruel remark over dinner, I told myself that the woman from the hospital waiting room was still inside her, just buried under temporary stress. Standing in the garden tonight, watching her face in the pale light, I finally accepted the truth. The woman from the hospital wasn't buried. She was gone. People don't stay frozen in the choices they made 10 years ago. They evolve into whatever they consistently choose to value. Alexis hadn't been corrupted by Bradley Kent or seduced by wealth. She had simply reached a point where status meant more to her than character, and she had chosen accordingly. "Money didn't make you ruthless, Alexis," I said softly, looking at her. "And Bradley didn't corrupt you. All this money did was give you an excuse to stop hiding the choices you had already been making in silence for years." Alexis swallowed hard. The The words hit her with more force than if I had shouted at her. Her shoulders slumped slightly, the last remnants of her pride dissolving into the cold air. "What happens now?" she asked, looking down at the damp gravel path. "Are you going to destroy my firm? Are you going to make sure I never work in public relations again?" "I don't need to destroy your firm, Alexis," I replied calmly. Carver PR handled the regional press releases for an event that just ended with federal wire fraud arrests on live national television. Your clients will make their own decisions by tomorrow morning. She closed her eyes, nodding slowly. She knew I was right. In the corporate PR world, being tied to a federal fraud scandal was a death sentence. "As for our marriage," I continued, "my lawyers will file the final divorce papers first thing Monday morning. You can keep the condo in Atlanta and your personal vehicle. I won't contest your ownership of anything we acquired together during our marriage. But you won't receive a single dollar from the Gerald Wells estate, from Wells Meridian Holdings, or from any trust associated with my family." "I understand," she whispered. "I won't be bitter, Alexis," I added, taking a step back toward the terrace doors. "And I won't seek revenge. But you and I are completely finished." She stood alone by the fountain, her crimson dress looking dark and heavy in the mist, as I turned my back and walked up the stone steps into Ashworth Hall. The news of Bradley Kent's arrest and the exposure of the conspiracy inside Wells Meridian Holdings swept through Atlanta's business circles within hours. By Monday morning, the story was on the front page of every major financial publication in the country. But while the national media focused on the corporate espionage and the federal wire fraud charges, a much quieter, more personal collapse was happening inside the modest brick condo where Carol Carver lived. For nearly a decade, Carol's entire sense of self-worth had been built on her daughter's social mobility. She was the woman who spent her afternoons at country club lunches, subtly dropping names of hedge fund managers, regional directors, and wealthy real estate developers into every conversation. She had spent years telling anyone who would listen that Alexis was destined for the top tier of Atlanta society, constantly framing my work as a structural contractor, as an unfortunate burden her daughter was forced to carry. Within 72 hours of the press conference at Ashworth Hall, that world completely evaporated. It didn't happen through a dramatic public confrontation or a court order. It happened through silence. On Saturday morning, Carol tried to call her longtime friends from the local charity committee to organize their monthly luncheon. Her calls went straight to voicemail. By Sunday evening, 3 separate social clubs she had spent thousands of dollars to join sent polite, formal emails notifying her that her memberships were being placed on administrative hold, pending the resolution of the public publicity surrounding her family. The wives of the executives she had cultivated for years stopped replying to her text messages. When she ran into a former neighbor at the boutique grocery store in Buckhead, the woman gave her a quick, uncomfortable nod and immediately walked down another aisle. Carol was radioactive. In high society, being associated with a failed fraudster who was currently facing 20 years in federal prison was worse than being poor. It was embarrassing. On Sunday night, desperate and terrified of what the future held, Carol called Estelle Monroe's private office at Ashworth Hall 6 times. When Estelle finally answered on the 7th attempt, Carol's voice was high, shaking, and frantic. "Estelle, please." Carol wept into the phone, her usual arrogant demeanor completely gone. "You have to talk to Jordan. He's putting Alexis out on the street. We have expenses. We have reputations to protect. He can't just walk away after 11 years and leave us with nothing. He has $800 billion. Giving Alexis $50 million wouldn't even register on his bank statement." Estelle listened to the tirade with the cool, practiced patience of a veteran corporate attorney. "Mrs. Carver," Estelle said, her voice dropping like a lead block, "Mr. Wells has made his position entirely clear. He is adhering strictly to the pre-existing legal framework of his marriage, as required by law. He is not seeking punitive damages against your daughter, nor is he pursuing legal action against you for your indirect involvement with Mr. Kent. That is a generosity you should appreciate." "Generosity?" Carol shrieked. "He lied to us for 11 years. He pretended to be a $1,000-a-week handyman while sitting on a fortune. He tricked my daughter." "Mr. Wells never lied about his character, Mrs. Carver," Estelle replied coldly. "He worked hard, paid his taxes, supported your daughter's career, and showed up when your family needed help. You chose to judge his value based entirely on his clothes and his job title. That was your choice, not his lie. If you call this office again, I will instruct our legal team to review your personal financial records for any secondary tax discrepancies related to Bradley Kent's gifts. Have a good evening." Estelle hung up the phone. Carol was left sitting alone in her dark living room, looking at a stack of unopened bills on her kitchen counter, realizing for the first time in her life that no one was coming to save her. On Monday morning at 9 o'clock, Alexis walked into the law offices of Monroe and Associates in downtown Atlanta. She came alone. She didn't hire a high-profile trial lawyer or bring a team of public relations advisors. She wore a simple black trouser suit, her hair pulled back into a tight, practical knot, her face free of heavy makeup. I was sitting at the long mahogany conference table alongside Estelle when Alexis stepped into the room. She didn't look at the plush leather chairs or the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline. She sat down across from me, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Estelle pushed a thin stack of legal documents across the polished table. "These are the final dissolution papers, Alexis," Estelle explained quietly. "Per Jordan's instructions, the terms are straightforward. You retain full, sole ownership of the condo in Midtown Atlanta, your personal luxury vehicle, and the entire balance of your personal checking and investment accounts. Jordan waives all claims to marital property acquired under his name during the past 11 years. Alexis picked up the silver pen resting on top of the folder. She didn't read the terms. She didn't turn the pages to look for hidden clauses or alimony demands. "And the Wells Meridian estate?" Alexis asked quietly, looking up at Estelle. "You waive all rights, present and future, to any assets, trusts, real estate or equity holdings tied to the Gerald Wells estate, Wells Meridian Holdings, or any of its subsidiary companies," Estelle stated clearly. Alexis turned her head and looked directly at me for the first time since entering the room. "You're being far more generous than I deserve, Jordan," she said, her voice steady but hollow. "If I had hired an aggressive lawyer, they would have told me to fight for a percentage of your father's estate. They would have told me to drag this through the press for months." "You could have tried," I said calmly. "And Estelle would have kept you in litigation for the next 10 years, until you were completely bankrupt. But I didn't set these terms to punish you, Alexis. I set them because I want this chapter of my life closed." She nodded slowly. "I know." She pressed the silver pen to the signature line at the bottom of the final page, signing her legal name, Alexis Carver, with a firm, deliberate hand. She didn't hesitate, and she didn't cry. When she finished, she pushed the folder back across the table to Estelle, stood up from her chair, and looked at me one last time. "Goodbye, Jordan," she whispered. "Goodbye, Alexis," I replied. She turned and walked out of the conference room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor until the heavy glass doors closed behind her, leaving Estelle and me alone in the quiet office. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I was standing on a timber scaffold 30 feet above the basement floor of the Central Public Library in downtown Atlanta. I was back in my steel-toed, boots, worn canvas work jacket, and heavy leather tool belt. The cool autumn air inside the unheated masonry hall smelled of wet mortar, aged granite, and damp plaster, the exact same scent I had breathed in 2 years earlier when I first uncovered Bradley Kent's inquiries tucked into the building's historical property registry. Below me, Dave, my senior crew foreman, was carefully setting a newly carved limestone lintel into a load-bearing archway. He tapped the block with a rubber mallet, checked his spirit level, and looked up at me with a grin. "You were gone a whole month, Jordan," Dave called up over the hum of the air compressor. We thought you finally bought a beach house in Florida and left us to fix this stone alone." I laughed softly, tightening a support bolt on the scaffolding frame. "I had some family business to wrap up, Dave. I'm not going anywhere." "Good," Dave said, wiping mortar off his trowel onto his sleeve. "Because the city inspector came by yesterday. He said if we don't finish reinforcing the south foundation wall by the end of the month, they might pull the historical permit and hand the property over to a private garage developer." "That wall has stood for 132 years, I said, climbing down the wooden ladder to the concrete floor. "It just needs someone who understands how to relieve the ground stress. It's not going anywhere either." Dave gave me a knowing nod and went back to his work. To him, to the 6 men on my masonry team, and to every subcontractor I had worked with over the past decade, I was still Jordan Kessler, the patient, quiet structural specialist who showed up on time, brought thermos bottles of hot coffee on cold mornings, and never complained about long hours in dark basements. They didn't know that 3 miles away, in the glass and steel tower housing the executive headquarters of Wells Meridian Holdings, a team of 40 corporate lawyers and financial managers were running the daily operations of an $840 billion global empire under my direct oversight. Every morning at 6, I spent 2 hours reviewing global supply chain reports, clean energy grid development metrics, and board resolutions from my private office at Ashworth Hall. I signed off on multi-million-dollar capital allocations, met with international division heads via encrypted video calls, and ensured that the corporate governance of my father's legacy remained completely solid. But by 9 in the morning, I traded my custom-tailored suits for my construction jacket, drove my old Ford pickup truck into downtown Atlanta, and spent the rest of my day working with my hands on historic buildings. I didn't keep working because I needed the money. I kept working because fixing broken, forgotten structures was where I felt most grounded. It was where my father had taught me the value of patience, the understanding that real strength isn't built overnight through flashy promises, but stone by stone, brick by brick, over years of quiet, honest effort. 2 days after the divorce decree was stamped, I instructed Estelle Monroe to draft the founding charter for the Gerald Wells Community Heritage Foundation. We endowed the foundation with an initial $300 million drawn directly from the private profits of Wells Meridian Holdings. The mission was simple and focused. Instead of funding glossy corporate galas or building trophy towers with my father's name etched on the glass, the foundation would provide full capital grants to restore historic churches, public libraries, community halls, and neighborhood landmarks in working-class and minority communities across the Southeast, places that municipal budgets and commercial real estate developers had silently abandoned. And the very first grant issued by the foundation went directly to the downtown Atlanta library, where I stood today. While I worked on the scaffolding, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text message from Estelle. Bradley Kent's legal team has officially opened plea, negotiations with federal prosecutors. The message read, "He is facing 6 years in federal custody without parole, plus full financial restitution to Apex Capital's remaining creditors. His partners in Charlotte have dissolved the fund entirely." I stared at the screen for a moment, then saved the message and put my phone back in my pocket. There was no joy in reading it, no surge of triumph. Bradley had chased an illusion of quick wealth, built a career on manipulation and stolen data, and ended up exactly where men like him eventually land, isolated, ruined, and facing the harsh reality of their own choices. As for Carol, her life had shrunk into a quiet, painful isolation. Without her social calendar, without her country club luncheons, and without the wealthy connections she had spent a decade bragging about, she spent her days inside her midtown condo, watching 24-hour news channels and avoiding her neighbors. The status she had craved so desperately had vanished the moment the world saw who she really was. And Alexis had left Atlanta entirely. 2 weeks after signing the divorce papers, she sold her midtown condo, packed her belongings into a single moving truck, and relocated to a small coastal town in South Carolina. She took an entry-level position at a local nonprofit community center, managing basic press releases and newsletter distributions, far away from the cutthroat world of corporate public relations. She didn't call me, and I didn't reach out to her. We had said everything that needed to be said in the quiet garden at Ashworth Hall. I picked up my leather tool pouch, pulled a fresh brass measuring tape from my pocket, and walked over to the south foundation wall. I pressed my palm against the rough, cold granite blocks, feeling the solid weight of stone that had survived over a century of rain, wind, and city construction. It was cracked in places, worn down by decades of neglect, but the core was still strong. It just needed someone willing to put in the work to fix it. 6 months later, spring arrived in Georgia. The historic library in downtown Atlanta was completely finished. The newly carved limestone arches were solidly set. The foundation stress was permanently relieved, and the grand reading room below was flooded with morning light through restored stained glass windows. At the formal reopening ceremony, neighborhood children, local historians, and elderly residents filled the wooden pews, filling the space with noise and life. I sat in the back row, wearing a simple gray linen shirt and dark trousers, watching the library director cut the ceremonial ribbon. There were no flashing news cameras, no high-profile financial reporters, and no security details surrounding the perimeter. It was just a quiet Saturday morning in a working-class neighborhood that had almost lost its history to a corporate parking garage. When the crowd dispersed, I walked outside to my pickup truck, sat in the driver's seat, and turned on the ignition. My life had settled into a quiet, sustainable rhythm. I still lived in my original, simple 3-bedroom brick house in Midtown Atlanta. I hadn't moved into Ashworth Hall, nor had I bought a sprawling mansion in Buckhead or an oceanfront estate in St. Simons. The house held 11 years of memories, both good and bad, but it was also solid, paid for with money I had earned with my own hands, and it kept me anchored to the reality I had chosen for myself long before anyone knew my last name. Twice a month, I traveled to Ashworth Hall to host the bi-weekly executive meetings of Wells Meridian Holdings. Sitting at the head of the long mahogany conference table in my father's old chair, I governed an $840 billion global enterprise with absolute authority. We expanded our clean energy grid developments across 3 continents, launched a major marine conservation fleet, and secured our digital infrastructure assets against speculative market raids. Under my leadership, the board of directors operated with total transparency. Marcus Vance and Arthur Pendleton had both been permanently stripped of their shares, forced into quiet corporate retirement, and barred from serving on public boards for the rest of their lives. The remaining board members understood very quickly that while I was a quiet man who rarely raised my voice, I would not tolerate dishonesty, backroom manipulations, or corporate greed. Bradley Kent's trial concluded 4 weeks ago in federal court. He accepted a formal plea agreement to avoid a maximum 20-year sentence, pleading guilty to federal wire fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft. The judge sentenced him to 6 years in a federal correctional facility in South Carolina, ordered him to pay $4 million in financial restitution, and barred him permanently from working in the financial services sector. According to news reports, when the verdict was read, Bradley didn't have a single family member, former business associate, or friend sitting in the gallery behind him. The network of influential people he had cultivated so meticulously had abandoned him the moment his legal utility expired. Carol Carver's life became a permanent footnote to that scandal. Unable to afford the high maintenance fees on her Buckhead condo after her social circle vanished and her credit lines shrank, she sold the property at a significant loss and moved into a small, 1-bedroom apartment in a distant suburb. She spent her days in virtual isolation, removed entirely from the country club luncheons and high society galas she had spent a lifetime obsessing over. Her obsession with status had ultimately stripped her of the very life she had tried so desperately to project. Alexis remained in South Carolina. She lived quietly in her small coastal town, working her entry-level job at the community center, taking on evening shifts at a local bookstore to cover her living expenses. A mutual acquaintance told me recently that she had completely deleted her social media accounts, stopped attending industry mixers, and lived a simple, unpretentious life. Sometimes, when I sat alone on my front porch in Atlanta on quiet Sunday evenings, I thought about the night she had thrown my canvas duffel bag into the damp gravel outside Ashworth Hall. I didn't feel anger toward her anymore, nor did I feel a desire for revenge. The anger had dissolved the moment I accepted that people cannot be saved from choices they actively want to make. If I had used my family's vast wealth and corporate legal team to ruin Alexis, to strip her of her job, or to destroy her family publicly, I would have proven her right. I would have acted out of spite, pride, and arrogance, the exact same traits that had brought down Bradley Kent and ruined Carol Carver. My father, Gerald Wells, hadn't built his life or his empire on bitterness. He had built it on patience, silence, and structural integrity. He had hidden my identity when I was 7 years old, not to trick the world, but to protect my character, to make sure that when I grew up, I would know the true value of hard work, the dignity of labor, and the difference between real strength and superficial status. I didn't preserve my father's legacy by destroying the people who betrayed me. I preserved it by refusing to become the cold, ruthless version of a wealthy man they had tried to turn me into. I put my truck in drive, stepped on the gas, and pulled out into the sunny Atlanta afternoon, heading toward my next job site. Real strength isn't proven by how loudly you crash into the world, or how ruthlessly you destroy those who betray you. It's proven by remaining anchored in your integrity when everything around you collapses. Money can buy access, luxury, and temporary status, but it can never purchase character, loyalty, or peace of mind. In the end, Jordan Wells didn't keep his father's $840 billion legacy because he possessed absolute power. He kept it because he never allowed the greed of others to change who he was.